Sun's up, quiet morning, and this one's a chapter I've been genuinely looking forward to since starting this book, because it's the first one that's actually about running specifically, and it happens to land on a question this channel has been circling since its very first episode without ever quite naming it this directly. The chapter is called Talent Not Required, and it covers a period after the military career, after the Trident and the Pin covered a couple episodes back, where Goggins entered the world of ultra-endurance racing as essentially a total outsider. No running background, no natural gift for it, showing up to extraordinarily long, brutal races against people who've been running competitively their whole lives. The book is direct about this. There was no natural talent for distance running involved. What compensated for that absence was an amount of raw, unglamorous work most naturally gifted runners never had to put in, because their gift had always covered for them. I want to spend this whole episode on that specific compensation, because I think it's the most directly, literally relevant idea this book has offered to a channel built around exactly the situation this chapter describes. Someone without natural advantages, competing anyway, using effort to cover the gap that talent would otherwise close. It's worth pausing on why this particular chapter feels different from the 7 that came before it. And I think it's simply this. Everything up to this point has been about internal mechanisms, honest accounting, tested beliefs, trained self-talk, things that apply to any hard pursuit regardless of what it actually is. This chapter is the first one that's specifically, literally about running, about entering a sport with zero background in it, and finding out whether that absence was actually as disqualifying as it seemed. For a channel built entirely around running, that makes this chapter land a little differently than the others, closer to home in a way the more abstract ideas haven't quite been. Here's the core distinction this chapter draws, and it's worth being precise about it rather than treating talent not required as just a slogan. Natural talent, in any physical pursuit, functions like an early discount. A talented runner reaches a given level of performance with less total work than someone without that talent would need to reach the same level. Asterisk, asterisk, that's simply true, and this chapter doesn't pretend otherwise. What it argues is that the discount only applies early. Past a certain point, talent stops being the deciding factor, and the sheer volume of accumulated work becomes what actually separates people, regardless of how the early years look for either of them. This produces a specific, somewhat counterintuitive pattern worth naming directly, because it explains something that otherwise looks strange. Talented people, precisely because things came easily early on, often never develop the specific tolerance for grinding, unglamorous, unrewarding work that untalented people are forced to build from the very beginning, simply because the untalented path never offered an easier alternative. The person without natural gift, having no shortcut available, ends up building exactly the kind of deep, hard-won foundation the naturally talented person often skips entirely because they never needed it to get the same early results. This pattern shows up constantly outside of running too, once it's actually being watched for. A student who found early schoolwork effortless often struggles more, not less, the first time genuine difficulty finally arrives, precisely because the specific skill of grinding through something hard was never actually required or built earlier on. A student who found early schoolwork genuinely difficult and had to build real study habits just to keep up often handles later, harder material with more resilience, because the underlying capacity for sustained, unglamorous effort was already there, built out of necessity rather than choice. Running with a body that offers no early discount follows exactly the same shape. I want to bring this into something specific and personal because this channel's entire premise sits almost perfectly inside the situation this chapter describes. There was never a version of this project built around natural running talent. The body this channel is run out of came with old injuries rather than any particular gift for distance. No early advantage. nothing resembling the discount this chapter describes for talented runners. Whatever progress has actually happened across these last 20 episodes came entirely from the other side of this chapter's equation: volume, consistency, and a willingness to do the specific, unglamorous work that a naturally gifted runner might never have needed to bother with at all. I want to be honest about how this actually feels to say out loud, because there's a version of admitting no natural talent that sounds like false modesty, and I don't want this to land that way. This isn't modesty. It's a fairly literal, checkable fact about how this whole project started. A body that had spent years being sedentary, joints already carrying old damage before any of this began, no athletic background, and running specifically to draw on. Someone with genuine natural talent for distance running, starting from that same medical history, would likely still have had an easier road than this channel's actual starting point did, because talent tends to compensate for exactly the kind of structural disadvantages this particular body came with. I think this is actually the most honest thing this channel can say about itself, and it's worth saying plainly rather than dancing around it. Nothing about this project has ever been talent-driven. Every single piece of progress documented across this whole series has come from the accumulation of unglamorous, repeated effort, exactly the kind this chapter describes as the actual substitute for a gift that was simply never available to begin with. Asterisk, asterisk, that's not a confession of inadequacy. According to this chapter, it might actually be the more durable path, precisely because it never had a shortcut to lean on, which means whatever's actually been built has been built on the harder, deeper foundation this chapter argues talent alone tends to skip. I want to walk through what the specific unglamorous work actually looks like, because just work harder is exactly the kind of vague advice this whole series has tried to avoid offering, and this chapter deserves a more concrete translation than that. For a naturally gifted runner, certain elements of training come close to automatic, efficient biomechanics that don't need to be consciously built, a natural pacing instinct that doesn't require obsessive tracking, recovery that happens faster without much deliberate attention. For someone without that gift, every one of those elements has to be built deliberately, consciously, through exactly the kind of specific, tracked, sometimes tedious work covered across earlier episodes in this book: obsessive checkpoints, deliberate discomfort exposure, careful attention to the difference between productive effort and real injury risk. The specific unglamorous work in this channel's case has mostly been the parts that never make it into a highlight reel. The strength training a naturally gifted runner might skip entirely. The mobility work addressing exactly the joints an easier body might never have needed extra attention on. The obsessive tracking covered several episodes back that a runner with natural instinct might never have needed to build in the first place. None of that work is dramatic. None of it photographs well. All of it, according to this chapter, is exactly the substitute this whole approach depends on, precisely because there was never a natural discount available to lean on instead. There's a specific ratio worth naming here, one that I think this chapter is quietly implying even though it doesn't state it in these exact terms. For every hour spent actually running, the unglamorous work this chapter describes probably deserves a meaningful fraction of that same time. Not an equal amount, but a real, non-trivial portion rather than the occasional afterthought it's easy to let it become. A naturally gifted runner might spend the overwhelming majority of their training time simply running, because running is what actually produces visible results for them. Someone substituting effort for talent likely needs a noticeably different ratio, with more of that time going toward the supporting work that isn't running at all, but that makes the running itself sustainable and effective. I want to name a specific detail from this channel's own history that illustrates this ratio concretely. During the months, this channel focused almost entirely on mileage, treating strength and mobility work as optional extras rather than core requirements. Progress was slow and injuries were frequent, roughly matching what this chapter would predict for someone trying to skip the unglamorous work while still expecting talent level results. Once the ratio actually shifted, more deliberate time spent on the supporting work relative to total training time, progress became more consistent and injuries became noticeably less frequent, even though total running volume didn't necessarily increase by very much at all. The mileage wasn't the missing ingredient. The unglamorous work surrounding it was. There's a piece of this worth naming carefully, because talent not required can get misread into something it isn't if it's taken too literally. This chapter is not arguing that talent doesn't exist or it doesn't matter at all. It's arguing that its absence isn't disqualifying, provided the specific gap it leaves gets filled with something else, namely a volume and consistency of work that a talented person often never has to develop. Asterisk, a naturally gifted runner who also puts in that same volume of work would, all else equal, likely end up ahead of someone building the same volume without the underlying gift. This chapter isn't claiming otherwise. It's specifically addressing the question of whether the absence of talent closes a door entirely. And its answer is no, provided the substitute work actually gets done, honestly and consistently, rather than assumed to happen automatically just because the door hasn't been literally closed. I want to be careful about a specific misapplication of this idea, one that matters enormously given this channel's history with real physical injuries. Talent not required is not the same as physical limits don't exist, and treating every constraint as simply something to be worked around with enough effort is exactly the kind of misapplication that turns a genuinely useful idea into something dangerous. The specific unglamorous work this chapter describes, strength training, mobility, careful pacing, obsessive attention to real signals, isn't a way of denying physical reality. It's a way of working intelligently within it, building the specific support structures a naturally gifted body might not have needed, precisely so the actual physical limits, whatever they genuinely are, get respected rather than blindly pushed against with raw effort alone. This connects directly to the productive versus damaging distinction covered a couple episodes back, and it's worth restating here because this chapter's whole argument depends on getting it right. Volume and consistency substitute for talent only when the volume itself is built intelligently, respecting real signals, rather than simply maximized regardless of consequence. A naturally gifted runner who trains carelessly might get away with it longer, because the underlying gift absorbs some of the damage careless training would otherwise cause. Someone without that gift, attempting to substitute raw volume for talent without the same careful attention to real signals, is likely to get injured faster and more severely, precisely because there's no natural advantage cushioning the mistake. The unglamorous work this chapter describes has to include the careful, intelligent parts, not just the grinding, high-volume parts where the substitute stops working and starts actively causing harm instead. I think this distinction is really the whole reason this book has spent 7 prior chapters building the specific tools this chapter's substitute depends on. Obsessive but honest tracking from episode 3. The productive versus damaging test from episode 5. Accurate rather than catastrophizing self-talk from the last episode. None of those tools exist by accident right before this chapter arrives. They're the actual infrastructure that makes substitute effort for talent a safe, sustainable strategy rather than a reckless one. Someone attempting this chapter's approach without any of that earlier infrastructure in place will be doing something considerably riskier than what this channel has actually been building toward across the last 7 episodes. I want to walk through what actually applying this looks like as a practice, because the idea of identifying and doing the unglamorous work needs something concrete to translate into rather than staying a general principle. Take an honest inventory of where your own training currently sits and identify specifically which elements would come close to automatic for someone with a natural gift for this particular pursuit versus which elements require deliberate, conscious effort precisely because that natural gift isn't present. For most people without a running background, that list usually includes things like consistent pacing discipline, structured recovery, strength and mobility work supporting the joints actually doing the work, and honest, ongoing tracking rather than casual intuition. Whatever's on that list is the specific unglamorous work this chapter is describing. And it's worth naming explicitly rather than leaving it as a vague sense that more effort in general is probably a good idea. I want to walk through how to actually build that list rather than just describing it in the abstract. Start with a simple, honest question about each major component of a typical training week. If a naturally gifted runner skipped this piece entirely, would it likely cost them very much? Efficient form probably wouldn't need much conscious attention from someone whose body naturally moves well. Recovery might happen faster on its own for someone with a more resilient physiology. If the honest answer for a given piece is a talented person could probably skip this and still do fine, that's a strong candidate for exactly the kind of unglamorous substitute work this chapter is describing. Precisely because its absence would matter more for someone without the underlying gift. Once that list exists, pick the single item on it that's been most consistently neglected, not because it's unimportant, but because it's exactly the kind of unglamorous work that never produces an immediately visible result the way a longer run or a faster pace does. For a long stretch of this channel's own history, that neglected item was strength training, mentioned honestly a few episodes back as a specific gap that took months to actually address consistently. Whatever the equivalent is in your own training, it's worth naming specifically and giving it the same deliberate attention the more visible, more satisfying parts of training already receive by default. I want to add one specific detail about how to actually make that neglected item stick, since simply deciding to address it rarely survives contact with an ordinary busy week on its own. Attach it to something already consistent, immediately after a run rather than as a separate session requiring its own motivation. The same way earlier episodes have argued for reducing the number of separate decisions a tired morning has to make. A neglected strength routine tacked onto the end of an already happening run survives weeks that a standalone strength session, requiring its own separate commitment, often doesn't. I want to add one final piece of guidance, because this chapter's whole spirit can tip into an unsustainable, joyless grind if it's taken too far in the wrong direction. The unglamorous work this chapter describes is meant to be sustained over years, not sprinted through in a few intense weeks and then abandoned from exhaustion. Building it into the same measured, once or twice a week rhythm covered in the episode on deliberate discomfort, rather than trying to do all of it at once, is what actually makes it possible to sustain the substitute this chapter describes for as long as it actually needs to run. There's a specific temptation worth naming here too, one that tends to show up right after a chapter like this one lands emotionally. It's tempting, having just absorbed the idea that effort compensates for missing talent, to immediately try to compensate for everything at once, tripling training volume overnight in a burst of motivated resolve. That's exactly the failure mode a couple of episodes back warned against when it comes to solving several problems simultaneously instead of one at a time. The unglamorous work this chapter describes gets built the same patient way everything else in this series has been built. One piece added deliberately, sustained long enough to actually stick before the next piece gets added on top of it. Tomorrow morning, whatever natural advantage you don't have, whatever gift this particular pursuit would have handed to someone else instead of you, isn't actually a closed door. It's simply information about which specific unglamorous work needs to happen instead, consistently, honestly, over a much longer timeline than a natural gift would have required. That work doesn't photograph well, and it rarely gets celebrated the way a natural talent's early success does. According to this chapter, it might be building something more durable anyway, precisely because it never had a shortcut to lean on. There's a wider thought worth closing on, because 8 chapters into this book, a pattern is starting to feel unmistakable. Every chapter so far has, in its own way, been an argument against the idea that some starting conditions simply disqualify a person from real progress. Whether that starting condition was a difficult childhood, an untested limiting belief, an impossible sounding deadline, or now the simple absence of natural talent for the specific thing being attempted. None of those starting conditions, according to this book, actually close the door they seem to close. Every single one of them just changes what the specific, unglamorous work has to look like on the other side of it. I think that's ultimately the real reason this particular chapter felt worth spending a full episode on, more than the specific running history it happens to describe. It's not really a chapter about ultramarathons. It's a chapter about what's actually available to someone who starts a genuinely hard pursuit without any of the advantages that would have made it easier, which happens to describe almost everyone who's ever stood at this channel's door in the dark or now in the daylight, deciding whether today's version of that same old question gets a yes or a no. I'll see you on the trail tomorrow. Same time, same choice, gift or no gift attached to it. This is Run to Evolve. One day, one run, one lesson, no excuses.